So, good afternoon, everybody. We have to start our lunch. Okay, we have some slides, if I can have it on, just to see where we are. So, we are here for a great event on the changing wildfires, policy options for a fire-literate and fire-adapted Europe, and just show where we are and what is ahead. A presentation, discussion, panel debate, and then a networking event, what is ahead of us in this afternoon. So my name is András Báldi, and I'm the chair of the Environment Panel of the European Academies Science Advisory Council. Let's call it EASAC, because it's shorter. So on behalf of EASAC, welcome you all here at the representation of the state of North Rhine-Westphalia to the EU, here in the room and also online who joined us. And the event is now the launch of this great report, Changing Wildfires, Policy Options for a Fire-Literate and Fire-Adapted Europe. Yeah, fires, flames, we lost hundreds of lives and billions of euro due to fires. And this EASAC report, which we launched today, provides the evidence base, the best available knowledge for European actions and policies. It highlights that Europe will increasingly have to learn to live with fire and adapt society to this new challenging reality. It's a landmark report prepared by a group of experts delegated from EASAC member academies. So this is the essence of European knowledge of fire. Just a slide on what is EASAC. EASAC's members are national academies from the EU, Switzerland, Norway, and UK, and some pan-European academic organizations. And the mission is to assess pressing scientific and societal questions based on scientific evidence only, enhance policy development and implementation by conveying knowledge and giving advice. It has three focus areas: bioscience and public health, energy, and environment. It provides independent platform for convening scientists, policymakers, and the public, and strengthen an academic network in Europe and also beyond Europe. I'm very happy to have such nice audience here and online to discuss this report. Some more details on the program. We will have first a presentation on the report in general. Then there will be two blocks. Both start with a presentation of the topic. The first will be on the preventing measures of wildfires, talk and a panel discussion, and then on policy coherence, again an introductory talk and a panel discussion. And then coffee break and networking, and please be reminded that this event is live streamed and it will be available later on the YouTube. So saying this, let's begin and invite our Environment Program Director, Elmqvist. Thomas is professor at the Stockholm Resilience Center of Stockholm University, also guest editor at University of Tokyo, and had leading roles at Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, UNESCO Man and Biosphere Project, Convention on Biological Diversity, and so on. So Thomas, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And thank you, András, for that introduction. I'm very pleased to stand here today to present for you the report, where there's been a lot of intellectual energy and work going into. More than 29 scientists across Europe have worked for nearly 2 years to pull this, to go through the scientific literature, to extract the most important information we have to address this really important challenge for all of Europe, the changing wildfire. So what we did was we took this concept of changing wildfire, went through the literature and tried to see what is actually changing and what are the root causes for these changes. So there are several chapters going through climate change and land use change and all other aspects that are influencing wildfires. But then, of course, we looked, what can we do about it? So then we also went through the literature. What is the evidence for preventive measures that actually work and would have a value for the future, where member states and the EU as a whole should it promote investment into these preventive measures. And then at the end, we are looking at how could all these policy areas in Europe, within the European Union, on biodiversity, forest, agriculture, how could they play together more coherently to address this challenge of increasing wildfire risk. And that the risk is increasing is absolutely clear. And if you look at the global context, you will see an upward trend from the beginning of this century. And actually in 2023, there was a record area of forest cover loss due to wildfires, which made, in 2023, it put wildfires as the most important driver of forest cover loss globally. It overtops forestry, all types of agriculture and commodification of forests. So wildfire is really an important issue globally. And it's not only affecting forests and properties, humans are being injured, and it's also lethal in many aspects. And in the report, we also deal with that in a chapter on wildfire and health, and also look at particularly the long-term consequences of air pollution coming from wildfires. There are some really serious health consequences of that too. So wildfires are changing, and they're changing in many ways: frequency, timing, and intensity, and impacting regions in Europe that historically were much less affected. But here we need to stop and think, and because there is an important distinction here, that what we see in Europe is actually a decrease in total area of fire, and but burned areas are now concentrated in a fewer fires, but much larger and high-intensity fires. So what is happening is two things. One is Europe has built a great capacity for emergency response to fight fires. So we have this huge capacity. We also have had a lot of changes that many low-intensity fires in agricultural landscape have stopped. So we have much less of these agricultural-related fires. So that explains why the total area gone down. But instead, the fires we have are much larger and much more higher intensity. And for the future, 1/5 of southern Europe may experience severe wildfire danger as often as every 2 years. And that's behind the part of the message we have, that we have to learn to live with fire. And as you see here, if you look at the projections for the future, Mediterranean stands out, where there is an accelerating risk of very large-scale, high-intensity fires in the future. That's true for Europe as a whole, because all other biomes are also affected, like temperate broadleaf forest, the boreal forest. Maybe the tundra, as yet, is not as much affected by the factors that driving wildfires. Yet responses in Europe are the same. In Europe, most resources are funneled into emergency responses, so firefighters, helicopters, airplanes, and only a fraction dedicated to planning and prevention, creating a significant imbalance. And this is what we point out in the report. And we also point out that there's actually a risk of society being overwhelmed. So this example is from Canada, where you see that the average over 20 years or whatever is about 5 million acres of burned area. So you build your firefighting capacity to handle that. Suddenly, in 2023, you have nearly 10 times as large fire, and there's no way you could handle that. So what we need to learn from the experience in Canada is that we have to put in these preventive measures to reduce the risks and reduce the risk of the society being completely overwhelmed. And the root causes, we absolutely have to address. And the root cause number one is climate change, causing prolonged droughts, reduction in summer rain. And these graphs here are built on actual data. And there is an elevated fire danger, particularly for Southern Europe, but also very much so for Central Europe, and becoming increasingly so. Another important root cause is land use change. So depopulation of rural areas and abandonment of farming areas where you have encroachment of shrubs and woody species is one source of wildfire. You also have forest growth, particularly when you plant large areas with coniferous trees and you have an even-aged monoculture. That's also a very important source of large-scale fires. And then something new, which we really need to put on the map, and that is urban wildfires. We haven't experienced really huge ones in Europe yet, but they will come, and we need to prepare for that. Europe actually stands out in the world with having twice as large of a vulnerable urban area than other continents like North America, Asia, or South America. So this is something Europe really needs to address. And it's also, we have to address it because it is affecting people's lives and huge costs. So here you see a graph of the cost of wildfires globally from 1991 to 2023. And then there is a huge bar going straight up, right up, and that's what happened in Los Angeles in January this year, where it's estimated that the cost is anything between 75 and 131 billion US dollars. And this, of course, a reason why we have this extreme high cost in LA is because we had a very high density of high valued property in that area. But we have those areas in Europe as well. So this is something urban planners need to address, but also I think many other stakeholders in society, because what we could see in the future is actually that if we had two Los Angeles fires more or less at the same time, we might have ended up in a global financial instability situation because the magnitude of values getting lost is on that scale. And this has been very much discussed in the academic literature, but is now discussed more and more also in policy forums and in the boardrooms of the insurance companies, particularly in the US, but also it's starting very much in Europe as well. So our message coming out from this report is, number one, prioritize to implement what's already been decided on mitigating climate change and the land use policies that are already in place, that they should be implemented. And then incorporate assessments of wildfire risks into all other policy areas in forestry, agriculture, and biodiversity, because it's easy to make mistake if you're not thinking about how different measures could actually increase or decrease wildfire risk. And then start to teach living with fire. This is sort of a mental change. We have to understand and be prepared to live with fire in Europe and to manage fire as part of the dynamics in the ecosystem, with a goal of reducing the risk of these huge large-scale fires. But we will have fires with us in the landscape for a long time. And then we end with 8 policy options that put together what the insight and the scientific evidence for a lot of preventive measures and how they could be brought together for a more coherent landscape approach and with the goal of reducing wildfire risk. And with that, I will hand over to Orsi that will talk about more specifically these preventive measures and the scientific evidence base we have provided for that. So thank you.
Thank you, Thomas, very much for presenting the report. And yes, now I invite Orsi Valko. Orsi is an ecologist from Hungary, a group leader with an outstanding publication record, congratulations. She works on plants, restoration, habitat management with fire. So, this is your turn to show what kind of preventing measures are there.
Thank you very much, András, for the nice introduction, and good afternoon, everybody. I would like to talk about the preventive measures, but first of all, I would like to briefly introduce the role of fire in the ecosystem and the interrelationship between the ecosystems and the fire regimes. This figure shows that different components of the natural ecosystems, for example, the vegetation, the topography, and also the climatic components and land use components interact with each other, and they modify the fire in different spatial scales, from the scale of a flame up to the scale of a fire regime. So there is a very important connection between fire and the environment, and also fires themselves are important drivers of ecosystems. So in a global analysis, Bond and colleagues found that fire, grazers, and competition between plants are the major factors that drive how the world looks like now. So why are there savannas in some places and forests in other places? These three drivers are the most important. So fire is an important and integral component of the ecosystems. And the effect of a certain fire on a certain ecosystem depend on the mismatch between the biotic factors and the fire regime components. So it's not the same whether the fire occurs in a certain season with a certain frequency or extent or severity, and what is the condition of the ecosystem at that time, and how well the ecosystem is adapted to the fire. And if the fire meets the historical characteristic fire regimes of the ecosystem, or we apply it wisely with a prescribed burning, then we can have a lot of positive effects of fire on the ecosystems. For example, improving environmental heterogeneity, supporting protected species, or improving forage quality. So it's very important to see that fire is not always bad, it's not always a catastrophe, it is a part of the ecosystems. But of course, as Thomas already showed, wildfires are changing, and this is the most important problem. This figure was already shown. I just repeat that there is projected that the very, very severe, very high intensity fires will increase in frequency in the future in Europe, and you can see that the occurrence of these fire events depend on the ecosystem type, and the Mediterranean type ecosystems will be the most affected, but also other types as well. And we need to consider also the effect of these huge fires on carbon. This is a very good figure which shows the carbon capture capacity of different ecosystem types, and I would like to point to the wetlands and peatlands here. These are very important ecosystems that store a lot of carbons below ground, and if they are in a poor condition, dried and degraded, then they can very easily burn, and this carbon can be mobilized into the atmosphere, and it takes a very long time to build up again. So this emphasizes the importance of peatland restoration actions. And in the working group, we wanted to show that Europe is, of course, a very diverse continent, and not all solutions fit to all regions. So we try to characterize the different main European regions according to the fire size distribution, the fire regimes, the most important fire-prone vegetation, and the societal processes that most importantly affect the fire regimes. And this summary table, I think it's very important when we consider how to manage fires, how to prevent fires, how to suppress fires in certain regions, then we should consider all these differences. And if we zoom into the Mediterranean region, which is the most fire-affected region of Europe, and where the most severe fires occur, we can see that, as Thomas already mentioned, the total burned area decreases over time. But there are huge peaks, and there are huge and very large fires in all the Mediterranean countries, which can have devastating effects. So because of this, it is very important not to only concentrate on suppression, but also on prevention. because unfortunately the suppression capacity is finite, and we really need to be prepared for managing fire-wise landscapes. If we know the ecosystem properties, if we know the fire regimes, and if we know the regional characteristics, we can choose from a large toolkit of different proactive measures which we can apply for reducing wildfire risk. For example, it seems a bit strange, but of course we can prevent fire with planned application of prescribed burning. We can control the available flammable fuel, and it can be a very useful tool for preventing wildfires. Also, there are other alternative fuel management techniques, for example, prescribed grazing or pyrosilviculture or agroforestry, which can be also very useful. And it's very important to use the available spatial planning tools. With this, we can identify potential hotspots, and we can prioritize these fuel management techniques in the very most important points where we would like to protect certain assets or biodiversity values. And of course, if a fire happens, we need to promote the natural regeneration of the ecosystems. It's very important to protect the soil post-fire, to prevent erosions, and to support the recovery of the native ecosystems, also preserving fire refugia. These are small microsites with characteristic microclimate or microtopography that can provide safe havens for animals and plants during the fire. And the very current policy movement and a very important point is that the EU envisages planting 3 billion trees, which is very, very good for carbon capture and storage and very good for nature conservation in many ways. But we need to consider that this can be problematic from the wildfire risk viewpoint. So it's very important to think about tree planting in that way as well. So that is why we analyze this topic in more detail, and we would like to recommend some ideas how to do tree planting to avoid introducing a large amount of flammable fuel to the landscape. So one advice from us is to select the sites for tree planting. There can be sites where tree planting might not be recommended, and in those sites we should prioritize restoring other types of ecosystems, for example, open woodlands or grasslands. But of course, tree planting can be very good in a lot of places. In those places, it's important to consider reducing the flammable fuel via strand structure and understory management in the planted forests. And of course, it's very important to conserve the moist and dense understory typical in boreal and continental forests, which can be a very good tool to decrease the wildfire risk. Of course, when selecting species, we should prioritize native and fire-resistant species and avoid pyrophytic species, which can be very flammable. And it is advised to move from monocultures towards mixed stand forests. And when it comes to synergies and governance, it's important to combine agroforestry, habitat conservation, and sustainable forestry, and incentivize these approaches by ecosystem service payments, carbon credits, and environmental schemes. And finally, this is my last slide. I would like to just show you that wildfire prevention is in connection with a lot of other sectors, and there can be synergies and trade-offs between the sectors. Just a few examples. For example, with agriculture, well-managed grasslands can act as fire breaks. It's very important and very good for the agriculture as well. With urban planning, if we plan a fire-wise wildland-urban interface, it's safe for the residents and good for the fire suppression. Or with biodiversity conservation, in good circumstances, prescribed burning can provide habitat for a lot of species with conservation interest. But of course, there can be a lot of trade-offs and conflicts, and we need to consider also those. With agriculture, there are a lot of agricultural practices that hugely increase wildfire risk, crop burning, residue burning, pastoral fires, so we need to regulate these. And also with biodiversity conservation, for example, if we use a lot of fire breaks, we fragment the landscapes and we decrease the habitat continuity. So we need to find a balance between fire prevention and conservation, and sometimes we need to find balance between different sectors to manage a fire-wise landscape. Thank you very much for the attention.
Thank you very much, and we are getting to the first panel discussion. We had two great talks. We know a lot on fires, even we have much more exciting questions inside. So let me invite Hector Alfaro from the Emergency Response Coordination Center from the Commission to the panel, Alfredo Branco from the GRC Joint Research Center, Jutta Paulus, member of the European Parliament, and our co-chair of the Wildlife Working Group, Orsia Valku. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much. Am I okay? Yes, the microphone is on. So welcome you here. And well, let's start maybe with a question that there is this great report and how it's possible to use it in the policy. How can you use it? Jutta, Paulus, let me ask it from you. In the work at the European Parliament level, can you put all this scientific evidence somehow into effect?
Well, if you ask me what role scientific evidence plays at the current parliament, my answer would not make you happy, I guess. Just as an example, I was negotiating the Water Resilience Initiative report, and actually we had to listen to some, let's say, debatable arguments, because did you know that it was only due to the goal of free-flowing rivers that 200 people died in Valencia? Not because we built into the retention zones, into the buffer zones, which were formerly left for the water when there would be an extreme weather event, and now they put houses there, and we're very surprised that these houses were flooded. But it was all the fault of the nature conservationists. So that's the level of debate we're facing in the parliament right now. But actually, I mean, coming from science myself, I always have embraced the inputs from the experts. I'm certainly not an expert when it comes to fire, but having negotiated also in the nature restoration law in the last mandate, I learned a lot about nature-based solutions and the role especially of peatlands. So I was very happy to read it in your report that you put such a strong emphasis on peatlands playing a major role in keeping water in the landscape, in also serving as a refuge when there is a fire. And I truly hope that my colleagues in the parliament will read at least the executive summary when we're talking about wildfires again.
Yeah, thank you very much. I have some questions, but if any of the panelists want to jump in, just say. If not, Hector Alfaro in the Emergency Response Coordination Center. So it's a response center, and we heard that it's the major part of working with fires, and the prevention is a weak part. So if it's possible, you move to a new big institution on wildfire prevention, or are you happy with this response part?
Well, I'm happy with the response part because I think that we need response, but the key prevention. I don't know. Can you hear me? Yeah, now it's better. So, in my opinion, I think that with solid prevention politics, and that if we are able to implement them, the response will be less and less needed in the future. And of course, resources are limited, and there are some type of fires that we don't have enough resource. So we need to work more in prevention.
And if prevention is 100%, then you can retire, no more work as emergency response.
I don't care. I can be retired. So I do prevention also in Spain. So.
Yeah. I also have a...
One of the problems is there is no glory in prevention. You will get a medal when you're a firefighting hero saving people from burning houses or whatever, but you won't get a medal if you work on prevention, trying to prevent the catastrophic event in the first place.
So how can you change it?
difficult. I mean, of course, you can always do, let's say, some sort of simulation showing had we not done this and that would have happened. Whether people believe you is on another page. Obviously, the US are taking the opposite direction right now because they now say you're no longer allowed to even measure the cost of those catastrophes, which is, okay, let's close our eyes, then maybe things will go away. But I think this is something where actually I have the impression that often the general public is more far viewing than politicians are, because especially when it comes to fire, it would affect them directly. So they are very, very much interested in preventive measures to protect their homes.
If I may, yeah, I think that I think that is reflected in the report, and it's education. Education is key here, and we also need to engage the population if we want to manage the landscape to reduce the wildfire risk. We need to engage the population.
I will just start on the question of hero. It's not just being hero. Usually, when you do some prevention and you spend some money in prevention and you are effective in doing your job, nothing happens. And then people start asking, why you're spending so much money if nothing is happening? So we should reduce the money we are spending in prevention, no? And this is a very difficult thing because you should prove that actually your measure are working and worked. And really, it's difficult because everything is fine, everything is bad. The more your job is good, the more what you do is working, and the less people will appreciate it. And that's the big problem with prevention. But actually, all of us, I think, we know that that's the path we should follow, because actually, what's happening is under the eyes of everyone. So things are getting worse and worse. But really, we should find a way to make really evident, really, let's say, clear to anyone that each euro, each money we spend in prevention is worth.
Yeah, it's something very similar to science and research that you don't see immediately its effect. So, Orsi, do we have enough knowledge for managing wildfires or fires for nature conservation, which is, as you mentioned, good for many ecosystems?
Yes, I think. Okay, so yes, I think fortunately there is a lot of scientific evidence to support this, and in the report we made a comprehensive review of this evidence, and I think that the most important thing is that we should consider the diversity of Europe and the diversity of regions. So we cannot say that, okay, if you have a forest, then you should do that and you will not have fire, because it depends on what type of forest do you have, where is your forest, what is the landscape context. So I think that we should support the land managers and institutions and the private landowners to help them navigate between the available tools to find the solution which is most suitable for them. Because I think that for all the cases, there is a solution which can be applied.
Yeah, and if we thinking a little bit more broadly, for example, on climate change and CO2 emission and tools, how to measure that, what can we say? What kind of tools we have? If these are efficient enough?
On measuring, I can talk for what we do from remote sensing, because actually we work almost on remote sensing. We can somehow have some proxies of the emission that a fire produces, starting from the measured intensity from satellite, knowing let's say the land cover. We can somehow project the emissions. The problem is that with the climate change is changing the game, because we can imagine that in the Mediterranean area, a forest, let's say 50, 70 years old burn, let's say totally burns, it emits CO2 and other pollutants. Then supposedly in 50, 60, 70 years, it should, let's say, recollect, retake the CO2. But given the changing climate, that forest probably is not going to regrow anymore. So that CO2 that has been emitted will remain in the atmosphere. And also the fact that we are seeing more and more in the boreal area, in the northern part of Europe, more fire in an area that before were not actually seeing any fire. And in there we have peatland, we have a lot of carbon stored in centuries there. That carbon, as soon as we will reach the atmosphere, will never go back. And it's something to consider, because otherwise, if the climate change was not here, let's say, we can say, okay, in 50 years that carbon will be back. So no problem, actually. But now it's not like that. And this is also something we should think about, because fire is not just making damages to the infrastructure, to the let's say, the properties, to the ecosystem. Is even increasing the air pollution and probably is contributing to climate change.
Yeah, you mentioned the Mediterranean region, and in the talk by Orsi that all these prevention measures should be very local specific. So can you add something to that? How to make it in real life, that for a given region or a country, how to shape prevention measures?
If I may, I would like to really specify that even more, because it's not clear to me, and I believe it might not also not be clear to others. Then you mentioned that it is problematic that abandoned farmland would accumulate fuel for wildfires. But what would naturally happen? Because the succession would naturally lead to some sort of ecosystem, I believe, and I can hardly imagine that any ecosystem evolving there would inevitably burn. So what would be your recommendation for this abandoned farmland?
I think it's a very important problem in a lot of European countries, this rural abandonment, especially in mountain regions and marginal regions. And with this abandoned farmland, because of the current landscape context and current situation, the competitive grass species gain dominance at first, and then a lot of other plant species disappear from these ecosystems, and after that very often there is a shrub encroachment, which leads to some secondary shrubland or maybe secondary forest, but often only shrublands with a lot of biomass, and this biomass is not really regulated by anything. So in a while, in a certain year, it will be on fire. So it's a very, very important fire risk, and for the rural development and also for the biodiversity conservation, it would be very important to revitalize these abandoned grasslands, pastures, meadows, and to reintroduce the grazing systems or mowing when possible, because it would be really result in a win-win situation for all the sectors. And if we don't do anything with these abandoned farmlands, it will stuck in a successional phase, which is not good for biodiversity, and it has a huge fire risk.
Well, I just want to follow up on what you said, Orsi. So how we can link these fire prevention methods to the nature restoration law and the potential nature restoration activities in the coming years, which is a great hope for biodiversity. And if it can be linked to fire prevention, maybe it help a little bit to get something really done. So what can you comment on it?
Wow, it's a very good question. I could talk about it for years, but I try to be very short. So, of course, the restoration of grasslands and abandoned farmland is a very powerful tool. Then, if we create a landscape mosaic, so if we consider to have multiple land uses and multiple habitat types within a certain landscape, then it can considerably decrease fire risk. If we utilize productive fire breaks, for example, with grasslands or open woodlands, it can also be very good. Also the restoration of peatlands, which was already mentioned, it would be very important to decrease the fire risk. So I think that the nature restoration law is the most powerful tool in our hands through which we can decrease the wildfire risk as well.
Yeah, comments on that maybe? You?
I really like that quote, and if anyone from the media is present, please put it down, because this legislation has also come under pressure because of the obvious thing, well, let's talk about competitiveness only, and everything has to become simpler and more easy for agriculture, for industry, for whatever. And I consider that a very short-sighted view, which in the long run will cost us not only in euros, but also in lives a lot more than adapting to a world where the climate has changed and will continue to do so, probably even accelerating. Also, what I've learned during my work on the nature restoration legislation, that the wildfire risk, at least for us in Germany, is mostly in let's call it spruce plantations or pine plantations. Not so much in the broad-leaved forest that would be natural if we had let them. So we had a fire in my hometown where pines caught fire in the month of August, which is, let's say, something that could have been expected. And the reaction was more like, okay, so we have to clear everything from deadwood so that this won't happen again. And that was also the discussion which we had for hours and hours when negotiating the restoration law, that this narrative, deadwood is fueling fire, is really catchy. And it's, I mean, of course it sounds logical. This wood is dead, so of course it would burn. But deadwood is not deadwood, so to speak. And the parameter, which is now as a voluntary parameter in the nature restoration regulation, is deadwood with a diameter of more than 10 centimeters, which is not those little twigs with a lot of air in between, which do catch fire easily, but real big logs. And especially when they're lying on the ground, they even prevent wildfires because they can store so much humidity. So I would be very much in favor of the wildfire specialists speaking out in favor of the nature restoration law.
Thank you. Do you have any comment on nature restoration and prevention?
And also, I would love to have an explanation. Why do you promote agroforestry as a measure to prevent wildfires?
Just a short comment to the deadwood. So I absolutely agree, and I think that we really need to balance between. So we really need to consider deadwood is so important for biodiversity that we need to keep it in the healthy forests. And I think, for example, in the broadleaf forest of the continental and boreal regions, this moist understory, which is the naturally occurring understory there, it can provide such a climate pooling effect, cooling and pooling effect, which can decrease the wildfire risk even in the presence of the deadwood. So I think it can be somehow balanced. And also regarding agroforestry, this is also a kind of a mosaic landscape with a mosaic stand structure, and if the herbaceous part is controlled, so the biomass is, for example, grazed or controlled in other mechanical ways or by prescribed burning, then the fire risk can be minimized. So it's also a very good land use for that.
Yeah, thank you. We had a lot of words on the prevention, but if there is a fire, there is emergency. So can you comment on what are expected in the emergency? What should be improved to have better response if there is a fire at the European scale or at national scale? Is it effectively organized enough across Europe?
Yeah, I think so. In fact, each country has the competence, but when the fire, let's say, overwhelms the capacities of the country. They also have Europe to support them. But I think that we always can improve, and we should improve in our fire analysis capacity. That is a way to prioritize when we have several fires in several places at the same time. And regarding what we were asking before about how can we do more visible our prevention, I think that one way could be when there is a fire, we always can see what's the potential of the fire. So if we identify the potential of the fire and we say, okay, here 5,000 hectares were burned, but the potential of this fire was 100,000 hectares, we can say, and here we did this type of prevention. So we can show the people that these measures are working. It's a way to do it more visible.
I was about to add on this, what we can do to improve. And I would say, as we were saying, we are doing well, actually. And in fact, we have seen also a decrease in events in burnt area more than events in the last years. There are big fires now. There are huge fires due to the different climatic condition, probably. What we can improve is, for example, monitoring, and we are already working on that. We are using new generation satellites to monitor fire progression in real time. We are doing a lot on that, and giving this kind of information to the let's say, the people on the ground, not only to the first aid personnel, but also to the population, is something very important, because may help in, let's say, in understanding who and how evacuate to timing, and that's very important on the side of the, let's say, the intervention when the fire is there. Regarding the prevention, we are going again and again on this. Really, we know almost there are a lot of things that we can do, and also in the education we can do a lot. Clearly, this is long-term investment, not because we are not going to see the results in the next year, or not even in the next 5 years. But actually, it's very important, because, as you were stating in the report, it's something that people should learn to live with, because it's not something that is going to disappear in the next decades. There will be more and more events. The wildfire-urban interface is the critical point in which almost we have the majority of the events and the majority of damage. Also in planning about the infrastructures, and the infrastructure we build, we should somehow, can I say, classify the critical infrastructure about also the fire sensitivity. So if we have something that is critical in an area that is prone to fire, we should be aware of that. So I think there are things that can help us in, let's say, tackling the next decades of fire events. And I know that we are working on this. It's not something that we still need to do. At least for what I know, any authority, all the let's say, the people involved in the fire management, they are aware of this change that is coming, as all the people here is proving, actually.
Thank you. I would like to open the floor for questions. So we have time. So if anybody has exciting question to the panelists, just please raise your, there is one. I think we have some microphones there. It's going. Just please introduce yourself and then.
Can you hear me? Hello? Yeah. Javier Albizu for the Spanish news agency, EFE. I wanted to ask if you could tell us a bit more about these urban fires that were mentioned before. in Los Angeles and so on, and how can we prevent that in Europe? I think you read in the summary that we have more risk, double risk than other regions in the world to face those. So what can we do and how can it be prevented? Thank you.
Thank you. Orsi, you want to?
Yes, I can. And
Okay.
after that, anybody from the working group, please help me out if you have some other thoughts. So yes, this wildland-urban interface is covering 7% of Europe, so a lot of areas. And it's very vulnerable to wildfire risk because there is a very intensive human activity there, which can cause ignition and fire. And it is very vulnerable because of the dense population, and it's next to the natural areas, so there is a large amount of flammable fuel. So that is why it's so vulnerable, and we can decrease the vulnerability by, of course, when planning new neighborhoods, then having enough distance between buildings, managing the vegetation in a way that it's not so flammable. For example, utilizing more areas for agricultural production to decrease the fuel availability. In existing neighborhoods in the small scale, everybody can decrease the vulnerability of their own yards by managing the vegetation there. Yeah, so with planning tools, we can identify the most vulnerable wildland-urban interface regions and plan direct interventions to prevent. So I think that there is a lot of things which we can learn from the Los Angeles event, because something similar can happen and probably will happen elsewhere.
Is somebody from the working group want? Oh, there is another question.
Yeah. Hello, I'm a member of European Parliament. I was with Mrs. Paulus for the ENI about water. I'm really surprised for this first explication, because I think I was firefighter. I fight in the south of France against a lot of fires and all around the Union and Europe. I think you forget one other solution. It's a fight, because I understand that it's necessary to do prevention, use natural solution-based, but I think it's necessary to have a better analysis. But I think you forget in your first panel other solution, and I think it's together that we can have less and less fire, but without the fight.
Yeah, Orsi or?
Just a short reaction, and maybe then other persons from the working group are more qualified for this. But of course, we think that prevention and suppression must work in hand. So, of course, without suppression, when there is a fire event, we absolutely need the emergency response and the suppression. So it's in the report, of course, but we rather focused on the prevention measures because they are underrepresented. So that is why now we presented them. But of course, suppression is absolutely important. Maybe Kathleen?
Just, it's better when it's said, because I think it's one panel necessary to manage fire for that.
Yeah, I'll jump in on that. Katelijne Stoof, I'm together with Orsi, I'm co-chairing this working group. I'm from Wageningen University in the Netherlands, and I'm a pyrogeographer. In terms of fire suppression and fire prevention obviously go hand in hand. What I've been thinking a lot in the lead up of today is, and I'm discussing with people as well, I mean, the message about, I mean, we all know that prevention is much more effective than suppression. You cannot only have prevention, you can also not only have suppression. And what was stressed in the presentations was basically how also within Europe there's a lot of variability. And speaking as a Dutch woman talking about wildfires, you might think, oh, in the Netherlands there's only water. We have water. Actually, we're in the biggest drought since the records began in 1906. And our fire service is an urban fire service. And so they're really good at stopping fires when they're really small with lots and lots of water. But as I'm Fernando, I'm going to mention you, another working group member from Spain. We do a project together in the Netherlands, and Fernando was sharing with our stakeholders that in Extremadura they say we don't fight fire with water, but we fight fire with milk, olive oil, and wine. And that's the living landscape that was referred to. Yes, I love the quote. It's in my presentation that I'll give shortly, because we do need a living landscape. And ultimately, the three things that we need is we need to have smart prevention, we need to have this living landscape. Then in addition to that, we need to have smart suppression, because we do need fire suppression, but in the Netherlands, what they mostly do right now is, and I quote my colleague from the fire service, Jelmerdam, they put wet on the hot, and that's the level of wildfire suppression that we have in the Netherlands. And then in addition to that, we need education, because we need to manage fire in a very different way. And the exact challenges with fire suppression and with fire prevention throughout Europe are gonna vary. But the basis is, the message that we give here is that we need a different landscape and we need more education. This is not a new message. And my question actually is how do we get through to people that this is something that needs to change? Like, do we really need another disaster? That's the big question. How can we get the change? Because otherwise, everybody keeps on thinking about fire suppression.
Thank you. There's a next question, please. The microphone should be somewhere. Can you pass there? Thank you.
Yes, I'm a senior fire officer in France. I appreciate very much the holistic view on this topic, which is emerging. But I find another gray zone in the report. Why didn't you associate economists to have a dedicated chapter on that?
As far as I know, we had economists.
Am I clear? Am I clear? Yes? Understood? No, in the chapter, I don't see economic issues tackled properly.
The program director can.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, we tried to get economists to do more deeper analysis, but we were not able at this stage. But that's actually, I agree with you, that's lacking. And also to bring in representatives like for the insurance industry. What's the attitude in the insurance industry to this emerging risk? And what are their sort of strategy to deal with it? You could think that the insurance industry could actually be an ally to create incentives for private landowners to manage the landscape in a way to reduce this wildfire risk. And in return, they might get a lower premium. So that could be like a mechanism that could, where the private sector could actually find a solution. But I totally agree with, we should have had a big chapter on the economic dimension, and particularly the insurance challenge connected to that.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Yes, there is one more question. We have still time, so.
Thank you. Is it working?
Yes.
João Silva, de GIECO. On economics of prevention, I would praise it not to reinvent the wheel, because we just spent, I think, 2 million in the GIECO 3 years ago in a big study with the World Bank on the economics of prevention. So I invite you to go to the Knowledge Network, and you have 3 chapters of economics of prevention of several risks, and even an e-learning course on the chapter. So thank you.
Thank you for the comment. Yeah. Any more questions from the floor?
I would like to make another comment, and thank you very much for bringing up the issue of suppression. About 2 weeks ago, I was in my constituency. We had an event. No, it's not really an event. So it was an open invitation to everyone to have a walk around the forest with the administration, so the authorities which are responsible for managing that part of the forest. I live close to a very large forested area, and of course, obviously, we were also talking a lot about wildfires, because the Pfälzerwald forest of Palatinate is the biggest undisturbed, meaning that there are hardly any villages inside. Some roads crossing the forest, but it stretches across the border to France. It's really a huge area which is covered by forest, and some areas within that forest are really far from any road. So there was also a local firefighter who was part of that event, and he said, if a wildfire happens to break out due to lightning or whatever at Drachenfels, we would need an hour from the nearest village to even get there, right? And we would have to bring our water and then drive an hour back to get more water, right? So this, of course, is an issue which we have to talk about. And then one other participant said, well, why not simply have a plane? Yeah, where do you get the water from to fill the plane? If you don't have a lake in the vicinity, then your plane doesn't help you anything, right? So there is a whole lot of infrastructure attached to suppression also, which people tend to forget. That was just the experience which I wanted to share.
Yeah, if I may, you don't need water to fight a fire. We fight fire with hand tools and fire. So you have more tools that in countries that they are not used to use those tools, they need to learn that there are more resources.
So part of the answer could also be more cross-border exchange.
Yeah, and we are doing it. We have we preposition firefighters from Germany, the Netherlands, and different countries in Spain, Portugal, Greece, and France, so they can exchange knowledge.
There's a question or comment from?
Yeah, I'm Urbano Fram. I'm a member of the working group. And I have a question for Mrs. Jutta Paulus, Member of Parliament, about your thoughts on or recommendations on the issue that prevention measures do not have political returns and may have political costs, as you have already mentioned. And so what kind of incentives can be built, or what kind of institutions can be built in order to plan in the mid to long term for helping decision makers to adopt measures, preventive measures, instead of just supporting those measures, suppression measures that have short-term political returns?
I wish I knew. No, because I mean, even if we look at the big catastrophe which hit my constituency a few years ago, when the Ahrtal was flooded and nearly 200 people lost their lives and billions of property were destroyed. The problem, so to speak, is that those people that have had an insurance are refunded by the insurance. Those people who didn't have an insurance were, at least in part, refunded by taxpayers' money. And if there is taxpayers' money for cleaning up after the catastrophe, but no taxpayers' money for preventing the catastrophe, or at least alleviating its effects before, then we do have a problem. But I think of course it's the natural reaction when there is someone there having lost everything. You won't say, well, I would have given you money for prevention, but no, poor luck. Of course you can't do that. But I don't yet know how to get this thinking of prevention is usually more cost efficient than having to deal with the catastrophe into people's heads. Also because of let's say, what I said before, there is no glory in prevention. You will get a medal for helping people in the catastrophe. You won't get a medal for having prevented the catastrophe, except if it's, let's say, obvious. So if you have, for example, in the case of an urban fire, if you have a fireproof building, and all buildings around your house are burned down, but yours isn't, then people might have a look, but not in any other case. So I wish I knew. It's a very good question.
Thank you very much for the question, for the many questions. Our time is over, so I have to thank all the panel members for the great discussion. Thank you very much. And we end the first panel. And we are entering the second block, let's say, which will start with a talk by Katalin Stuff. She will talk on policies. Katalin, as she mentioned already, specialized in pyrogeography. Pyrogeography, which is the interdisciplinary study of the distribution and functioning of wildland fires. So, Katalin, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And I start this afternoon by showing something that my daughter gave me this morning. She's 4 years old, and she said, "Can you please show this to Brussels today?" So I'm showing my bracelet today. All right. Policy options for a fire-literate and fire-adapted Europe. Basically, what I'm gonna do is, you may have seen this copy, the summarized copy of the report. Actually, it's what I find very helpful, and this is EASAC's organization, but our main messages are right in the front. So on page 7, you have the urgent key messages and the 8 policy options. Then you'll have the policy options again. You'll have this figure about the type of policies that are possible, and then there are a number of pathways and a number of activities that go with the different policy options. So what I'm going to do in the next 7 slides is walk you through the main message of that. Because as I was discussing with colleagues in advance of today, a colleague from Portugal was saying, well, is this all new? Like, we all know this, right? We all know that we need to change. We all know that fire is changing and something needs to be done. And one of the very big problems, one of the very big challenges is that these studies are keeping on coming out and out and out, scientific studies and reports, but no change is being made. And so I also don't have the solution to that yet. I work a lot with a colleague of mine from disaster science, and I always say, Jeroen Warner, he specializes in water, by the way. And I say, Jeroen, is there something that we can do in the case of fires to make sure that, for instance, in the Netherlands, we don't have to have a recent disaster in order to get change? And he's always very optimistic, not? Because he says, well, Catalina, the science shows that you need frequent disasters, otherwise there will not be any change. And then I say, okay, let's at least learn from the disasters in other countries, like, for instance, from Portugal, in order to prevent a disaster in other places. So anyways, what we try to do with this report, and specifically with the parts that I'll walk you through right now, is these policy options. We want to show that this is not about reinventing the wheel. There are basically hooks that we can use in order to make this concrete and hopefully help the policymakers make change. All right, so what we're seeing, and we keep on seeing, is fire is becoming more extreme, and the response is often a very reactive response. People think fire is bad, and that fire is always bad, and that is, in a way, understandable, because in urban areas, you're not going to say, okay, let's burn the kitchen down every 7 years to prevent the rest of the house burning down. Well, actually, in nature, you might say, well, for instance, the heathlands, let's burn the heathland every 7 years in order to rejuvenate the heathland and also make sure that the other parts don't burn down. So urban fire and wildfire are very different. Despite that, the decisions that are often made about wildfires are made in places, in urban places, where there's a disconnect between how fire was used and the role of fire. And there's a disconnect between the full understanding of fire and actually decisions taken about fire. So the response is reactive. People think that fire is always bad and needs to be stopped. And in that response, there's an assumption that fire always can be stopped. And this is the point where I get the shivers, because, oh, actually, I was expecting a big screen there, but you'll see a screen there and there. The reality is different. we cannot stop all fires. I mean, this is Portugal, but there's also good examples from Australia. Maybe you remember the fires burning in the Australian Black Summer about 5 years ago. And those fires, you could see aerial support, so airplanes dropping water, but that's like, in Dutch we say it's fire on a glowing plate, like nothing is happening. And those fires only stop when they reach the sea or the ocean or they reach the desert. Like you cannot stop these fires. The only thing you can try to do is keep the people safe, keep your ecosystem safe and prevent the suffering. But Europe has a choice. And so the choice is that we can continue to be overwhelmed, or we can stop focusing just on flames and short-term save and rescue, and instead focus on the root causes. We can instead develop, implement, and finance policy to address those root causes. Because we're always thinking about fire in terms of fire suppression, but actually, what we do need is we need to look at the whole cycle. We need to look at integrated fire management. And that is not just about how can we stop the fires, assuming they can be stopped. It is about how do you want your fire? Because fire is there, you can't get rid of it, it will be there. And then the best thing is to think about, okay, how do we want it? Where do we want it to burn? And how do we want it to burn? And what is acceptable? So instead of talking about how do we stop the fires, it's about controlling how the fire burns and where the fire burns and when the fire burns and what kind of impact those fires have. And for that, you need not just to focus on the emergency management, but you need to focus on the whole management cycle. And that's actually about keeping people in your landscape, having access to roads and schools and internet. And it's not just in the Mediterranean, but it's also beyond. Because yes, fires burn in the Netherlands and places like the Netherlands, and we have a massive issue with that. It's a big problem. So what we need is a fire-literate and a fire-adapted Europe. Our country has a problem, but we also have a solution. And that is the solution to this lies in our world-famous water management. Because what we do in Dutch water management is we don't just talk about water when we're up to here in a flood. We also don't just try and get the water out. We manage the landscape and our education system and everything and our finances in order to make sure that if it floods in a place where we want it to flood. It floods in a way that we want it to flood. And actually, there's a lot that my country can learn in terms of wildfires. But our government published a letter, like a parliamentary letter. So it's a parliamentary decision, or yeah, it's a parliamentary action in which they wrote, to prevent disaster, having fire in the landscape is part of the solution and not part of the problem. Well, to see this from a Dutch government, I was actually on Cyprus with a colleague of Tiago and Tiago Oliveira from Portugal, AGIF, and he had the shivers going down his spine because this is how you need to look at fire. It will be there. So, instead, well, there are several options. So this figure shows on the left, there's a possibility to continue current policies, the reactive policies. There's also a possibility to strengthen reactive policies. You then have a reactive fire regime that is high impact wildfires. Instead of that reactive fire regime, you can also have a proactive fire regime with low impact wildfires. And we intentionally put here high impact and low impact, and not just high intensity and low intensity, because you can't conflate the two. We talk about low impact wildfires. That's not necessarily a small fire, because a small fire can also have a lot of impact, and a large fire can also have very little impact. But basically, the options that are available is we can go from a reactive to a proactive fire regime, one with high impact to one with low impact. And we can strengthen or integrate policies. And basically what underlies this is that we resist fire or we accept fire. So we accept the presence of fire to control its impacts in that proactive fire regime part. And the discussion then is, how do you want to fire, and what is the level of risk that we accept, and what does that mean for your people and your landscape? So now I go to the report. So there are 4 pathways for policy, and those are again in this one. And so that's continuation of current policies, strengthening of reactive policies, strengthening of proactive policies, or integrating policies affecting wildfire risk. And then I go to the table at the end, where we outline what that means for your wildfire regime, your wildfire risk reduction, policy integration, management of ecosystems, biomasses and soils, planning of landscapes in urban areas, rural economy, public risk awareness, and multi-hazard approach. And I'm not going to go through this in complete detail, but here you see the table. So for instance, in the part about wildfire policy integration, I highlight this one. In the part about integrating policies affecting wildfire risk, if one chooses that policy pathway, one activity is to create better articulated multi-sectoral and whole of government wildfire policies, wildfire risk business models for the insurance sector, and also adoption of a landscape fire governance framework. And I like to plug this one here. So QR code, read that document. We can achieve that through 8 policy options that all have their actions, benefits, and costs. And I show here the colorful table that Thomas already showed. Ultimately, it's about landscape fire risk governance, including fire literacy. And the 8 policy options that we present are integrated wildfire risk reduction, adoption of nature-based solutions, embracing the ecological and cultural role of fire, and investment in education and communication for wildfire awareness. And then on the other hand, investment in landscape management to reduce vulnerability, harmonizing sectoral policies, promoting compact urban development, and encouraging sustainable private land management. More details can be found here, and for instance, in the education and communication part, this is about increased fire literacy and preparedness through education for all ages, and it's about integrating wildfire education in curricula and public awareness campaigns with a focus on fire literacy and management skills. And this can help create better public understanding and preparedness and more informed land use decision and skilled professionals. We also included a list of concrete examples, and this is not in your summary printout, but I'd like to highlight 2 examples, once again from the Mosaico project, Fight Fire with Milk, Wine and Olive Oil and Hot Water, but also Ramats de Fok. It's a project to stimulate grazing, and actually it's about a whole chain from the training the shepherds all the way to marketing the animal products with the seal of wildfire prevention. So this is not about reinventing the wheel. The examples are already there. Summarizing, I go back to the key messages from the report that Thomas shared at the beginning. The key message for a fire-literate and fire-adapted Europe are to prioritize policy intervention. So the existing EU climate change mitigation plans and land use policies to address wildfire risk. The new nature restoration law, particularly to restore the peatlands and manage the forest to reduce the risk. Incorporate assessments of wildfire risk into biodiversity and tree planting initiatives. And to live with fire, enhance public health interventions and education on wildfire risk. And with that, here. With that, I think we go to the panel discussion.
Thank you very much. And we are entering the second panel discussion. I invite Claudia Berchtold. Please come to the stage from the Sustainable System Transformation Risk Reduction from Fraunhofer, Tiago Oliveira. Please, President of the Portuguese Rural Integrated Fire Management Agency, Jutta Paulus. Again, please, member of the European Parliament, and our working group co-chair, Katalin. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. Thank you for the introduction, Katrin. And now we will get into the policy options, policy coherence, how all these knowledge, scientific knowledge can be probably get to life. And I would like to start again now really on the policy focus on how you see Utah from the European Parliament, these policy options. Is there a possibility to make a coherent wildfire policy?
I think those it's the policy options are, let's say, very general, and they have to be general because Europe is so diverse. So the option of, let's say, adopt nature-based solution, a nature-based solution to prevent wildfires might look differently in the Netherlands than in Finland or in Greece. So I think these options in general are, of course, something I would embrace. I'm not sure in how far, looking at the judicial way, the EU would have the competence to actually prescribe this sort of policies for the European member states. I mean, of course, there's always the instrument of money, obviously. So integrating this sort of policy into the next multi-annual financial framework would be a good idea, I believe. We do have the RESC-EU where we're looking at the other side, where we're not looking at prevention, but actually at supporting each other when it comes to actually firefighting, of course. And there have been some very good examples in the recent years where this has helped the affected member states, that we had this common response to wildfires. And I think what also would be very helpful to have much more cross-border exchange, not only among the firefighters, but also among the fire preventers. Because I'm not sure whether this is discussed a lot at the Covenant of Mayors or in the Committee of the Regions or in any of these points where people from over Europe which work at the regional level actually meet each other. I think what, of course, obviously the EU can always do is come forward with guidelines, come forward with good examples, come forward with we'll show you how this might work or that might work. But when it comes to the actual spatial planning, this is, of course, in the remit of the member states. And with the nature restoration law, we already did something to actually support this. For example, when it comes to species diversity in forest ecosystems, when it comes to restoration of peatlands, when it comes to having the diversity of agricultural ecosystems as an indicator, which also would, of course, enhance agroforestry. So there are already some elements in there, but generally the member states have a lot of leeway when it comes to their own policy. And I doubt that member states would like to have it any other way, to be honest.
Yeah, thank you. Claudia, I know you have some ideas on policy coherence and wildfire. Would you share with us?
Yeah, sure. Thanks a lot, first of all, for the invitation. Yeah, I'm here in my role as a coordinator of the Fire-literate project, which is a coordination and support action that brings together about 70 million in research funding on wildfire risk over the past couple of years. And in that role, we also conducted a study on policy coherence related to wildfire risk. And I think what is interesting is that it very well complements with your report. So what we analyzed were different policy fields, from civil protection to health, to forestry and agriculture, nature and biodiversity. And what we see is that actually we would find references on wildfire risks in all of these policy initiatives or documents at the European level. However, they differ very much in nature. So what we would find, for example, very little is integrated fire management or references to integrated wildfire risk management. You would find terms such as wildfire risk, but usually is the risk part of it. So this bad part of it. What we also find very little is more embedded reflections on the use, for example, of nature-based solutions and wildfire risks. So, in that sense, I think there's still room for feeding exactly your points better into the existing frameworks and to reflect a little bit deeper on, specifically nature-based solutions, for example.
Thank you. Tiago, you are from the Integrated Fire Management Agency. So what are you integrating? Prevention, response, policy, institutional background, funding? Is it working well? Is it a good example for others?
Well, thank you for the invitation. I also work in this working group, being nominated by the Portuguese Science Academy, because I studied before having these activities. After 2018, I made my PhD on fire risk governance. And I think it's the critical issue here, because at the European level and outreaching Europe with the Portuguese experience, I think the European Union also have all the resources, all the pieces of the puzzle to have a solution on the grounds. But the pieces of the puzzles need to be well integrated. And it's mostly about knowledge. And if you understand that fire is the synthesis of the context, quoting Stephen Pine, and if we assume, and it was recognized that the land use is the driver of the fuel accumulation and the stimulus, economical stimulus, that is behind of the decision-making of the owner of the lands, what to plant, how to plant, how frequent do I treat the fuel. Now we think that it's critical to foster a different attitude at the political level, at the leaderships of institutions at the European level, DG Agri, DG Envy, DG Climate, all of this. And this report, I think, highlights the responsibility of having the knowledge available for the better decision-making capabilities that is really missing and is critical for the European Union in the years ahead. Also at the European Parliament, also at the Commission. So, what I'm trying to say here is that technology is useful and suppression is critical, but we can't suppress prevention. We can't overrun everything with technology, because this is a social, economical problem. We won't solve it with technology per se. So this positive approach that we have on dealing with the problems with throwing technology to it, we won't solve it. It will help, but will lead us on managing the resources more effectively. And to do so, we need to frame the problem with the proper lenses on the governance. And that means cooperate, leadership, and be focused on policy making. And I think it's urgently needed that we recognize that we do need suppression, but suppression will not solve the problem per se. So all this report was written in order to make more lively for the politicians and to do a good summary, executive summary, to highlight the drivers of the change. Because I think the European Union, with this climate change, with the way that the urban development and the way that the Common Agricultural Policy and the Biodiversity and the Restoration Act and all those are just leading and are exposing the citizens and are exposing our environment to fewer fires, but with more severity, which later on give us worse and very dramatic losses. So it's important to discuss the findings. The information is here and it's available. So we can't suppress these reports, and I think we need to discuss what the findings are being presented now.
Yeah, I absolutely agree that this is the responsibility of the researcher side, the science side, to put together the best available knowledge on an important topic and put on the table of policymakers. otherwise, yeah, we miss an opportunity.
Because what we felt in the last 7 years in Portugal, a transformation process, and we were the first country in the world to shift from a suppression mind framing approach. We were spending 80% on suppression, now we are spending 45%. But it's not about the amount of money we are spending, it's the way the money is being spent. And the only way to mobilize all the society towards a solution is with the good knowledge, is with the capability to speak and to support a dialogue in this complexity, ambiguous, driven issue. Because every one of us believes a single solution will solve the problem. And it won't. It's a complexity, it's complexity problems, it's wicked problems, need several solutions at the same time. And if we are driving towards a more conflicting society with different agendas, with different, with more command and control regimes, I would say, I think we need to have the knowledge always in the table to allow us the dialogue to drive us to long-term solutions. And I think this report is quite important in this matter.
Yeah, and linked to that, I mean, the knowledge is there clearly now. I mean, not everywhere. And this is where the education comes in. This is where the fire literacy comes in. So we specifically talk about fire literacy, and also in the broadest sense of the word, because I mean, if you look at higher education, you can study forestry, you can study emergency management, you can study sociology, you can, I mean, we have silos, and those are also the silos that many of the organizations work in. And actually, if we want professionals to be able to engage in this integrated manner, and also, I mean, one of the things we're discussing is how can we get the scientific message in such a way that it is helpful for people like you and for people that need to make decisions ultimately. That is, I mean, you can't assume that people know how to do that if they're only in their own disciplinary bubble, if they're only in their own sectorial bubble. So we need a different way of training people in higher education, but not just higher education, also in vocational education. We need much more integration between science and practice and policy. But in order to have that, you need to distill that. You need to instill that in people during this education. And then we talk about the school system, but actually ultimately it's about much broader as well. We need to do a much better job in engaging with society. I'm not saying communicating to society, because I mean, I think you were saying people are very interested. Well, in the Netherlands, people are not very interested in fire, because people still laugh when I say I work on fires. We don't have fires. Anyway, but people are even in places where we often have fires. So I lead the Paralife project, in which we train 15 early stage researchers in integrated fire management. And some of the research that's coming out of that project was led by Isabeau Ottolini and Kathleen Uiterwaal. They're showing that people that work in a landscape and live in villages, they don't necessarily care about fire. They're not worried about fire. They're worried. Their main concern is how to put bread on the table, that their children go to school, and so ultimately we need to invest in broader resilience, because then the fire resilience will be a part of that. But the reason we talk about fire literacy is because, yes, the knowledge is there, but we need to do a much better job in getting that knowledge from the different silos and integrate that. And that needs to be embedded in the way that we train people in schools, but also outside of schools.
Yeah, can I add to that? Okay, yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, so as I mentioned, I'm here on behalf of a cluster of project on wildfire risk management. And that cluster of project will also have an event tomorrow and the day after that, and we'll be presenting a strategy proposal for Europe. And I think that very well complements what is also written in the report. So what we, for example, recommend is knowledge sharing. This is something that was already mentioned in terms of programs. So we have that very much on the response side. But we don't really have it for land use planners or for foresters, so to establish specifically that at the European level. And I think what is also an interesting aspect to actually make people work together is the development of targets, right? You have it in Portugal, but I feel that in many countries, this approach to actually come up with a target and an idea on where you want to go is still lacking. I mean, of course, we also have data problems, right? This is also something that we discussed. Of course, you need the data if you want to set up a target and actually monitor it. But I think there, for example, there are now very good advances in with remotely sensed data that could potentially replace or at least support, let's say, databases that might not exist in certain areas. So yeah, just to add that, I think there's really a lot of room to enhance further, and there are a couple of measures that we could install to facilitate that.
Yeah, well, we are working on how to make good policy, good education, but these are long-term processes to develop, and if we get to the end, there will be an absolutely different environment around. So how you see, let's say in 10 or 15 years, will we face brand new problems, new challenges, or what we are thinking here and making a solution will work in 15 or 20 years? Let's say on building coherent policies.
Okay, I can try to answer. I mean, what we the study that I mentioned was a European study. So what we find is the references to wildfire risk are at least integrated into the main relevant policies, from biodiversity to forestry. However, for me, the question is a little bit like we didn't analyze this in detail. How does it look at the national level, or how does it look at the municipal level? So and I think that the better regulation framework helped a lot in really mainstreaming this aspect and making the links between different sectors. But yeah, we're not really sure in how far this is really reflected at the lower levels. And potentially this is something to work on, really, to put the multi-stakeholder collaboration on the ground and consider all the relevant and sometimes conflicting views and interests.
Yeah, I think it's if we follow business as usual in the next 15 years, I think we are going to lose the game. Because the technology is there, the suppression resources is there, the agenda for suppression expenditures will always pop up after a big fire event, and then the politicians will decide to suppress the fires with suppression. So we do know that it's happening everywhere. So I think what is critical here is to allow all this knowledge that is available from different experiences, Canada, Australia, South Africa, Chile, Portugal, everywhere, that can be available to the politicians when they are designing the policies. I think a good technical steering need to be there, to be available for them to promote the advantages and to reduce the disadvantages of the synergies and conflicting agendas that Orsa expressed there, because it's always a trade-off. And I think this is not rocket science, but it's a complexity-driven issue that calls for action on the present terms with the proper forward-looking foresight, because we are just avoiding consequence in the future. And it demands a lot of action through time and through space. And if we believe that this huge institutional challenge is the way we need to address the problem, to have an all-over-government approach, I think we need to be more active in putting these agendas and putting these institutions in Brussels working together for a common purpose, not from their silos perspective, but for an integrated approach. And we experienced this in Portugal in the last 7 years. And the only way we would manage is to be under the command of the Prime Minister, because if we are under the Minister of Agriculture or whatever, it's very difficult, it's very hard to reach other silos. So this transversal approach, this horizontal perspective is really important to speed up the change and to promote more effective and efficient policies.
So just a quick question to the European Parliament representative. So what step is missing at the EU level to make such a development as in Portugal?
And if I can add to that, what do you need from us? Yeah.
Yes. More visibility. No, it's really a problem because science gives us all the answers that we need, but it's not sufficiently listened to. And when speaking with colleagues from other political groups, I often hear, well, science says that, but then I had a visit from put in whichever industry you want, and they say differently, so it's not really clear, is it? And I'm like, well, there is a difference between what scientists do and what people do that are there for a profit. But that difference is not entirely clear to everyone, and that is a problem. I think what actually would help, but that is something that the European Parliament cannot do, but that the European Commission could do. I mean, we have this better regulation, which means whenever the European Commission wants to come forward with a, oops, leave it, it's okay. Comes forward with a legislative proposal, there is a certain series of actions that the Commission has to do. Like ask the public, like ask the stakeholders, like make a compilation of all the answers, and then do the famous impact assessment. Meaning we look at the policy options which we derive from our goal plus from the input that we got from the stakeholders. And then we are looking at the different options and also looking what impact do these options have. How much money would we have to spend on that? How much money would the member states have to spend on that? Which industries, SMEs, and so forth would be affected, blah, blah. There's always the most interesting part for a lot of my colleagues is the cost of action. And what's missing is the chapter cost of inaction. If we had that, the cost of inaction, I think that really would help a lot, because those impact assessments are also public. So anyone can just download the impact assessment and of course can, let's say, talk to the media about it, saying, hey, my politician tells me he or she wants that this or that policy option should be chosen, but if I look at the impact assessment, the cost of inaction would be much, much larger. So maybe this would help, because our world obviously functions only through finance and not so much through, let's say, the co-benefits, which can only very differently be monetarized.
So it's to get this in the impact of EU policy assessment, to get a line there or a chapter about the cost of inaction. Yes. Who do we talk to?
Ms. von der Leyen.
Yeah, she's not here at the moment. May I ask the floor? It's open for questions for the policy coherence or for any other fire topic. If there are questions still. Yes, there is a question. Microphone is going.
Hello, Jessica Hetzer. I was working in the just finished project Fire Risk, and I was wondering, so as one of the strategies, it is listed encourage sustainable private land management. And what I learned, to my surprise, is that the private land is often owned by people who are not living in the area. So I wonder how you are tackling this problem.
I mean, the obvious answer is, of course, I think it's around 50% of the land in the EU is farmed. And I don't know about the numbers in other EU member states. In Germany, about 60% of the farmland is not owned by the ones who farm it. So basically, they have to rent it from the landowner. The landowner usually knows very exactly how large is the EU subsidy on each hectare of land, because that's how he measures how high the rent should be. So if we had a common agricultural policy which would include also risk management when it comes to wildfires, and which would make the cap subsidies depending on whether this risk is somehow addressed in the way the land is farmed, then obviously that would be a very large incentive.
I think it's critical to value the natural resources or the forested resources. So you only care for something that you love. So you only care for something that has a value. And what we have concluded through time is that all these non-timber forest resources are with very low value. So if you want to, I think you need to evaluate the positive externalities of those assets, and then you need to find a way to share that value to the farmers that don't live there anymore. They move out to cities and they left the lands, but they have a relation, a patrimonial relation with the land, although they don't profit with it. Even they are paying taxes for the land that is not being used. But it's an economic problem. You need to share the value with them. You need to share all the profitabilities with it. And because the social capital to the local village is so low, you don't invest it in having cooperatives, forest owner organization, whatever, with financial muscle to share the value up front. So you need to put finance back again. There is a good examples in the United States as forest resilience bonds and green financial schemes that need to be quickly deployed to the landscape, despite all these subsidies of common agricultural policy that are too bureaucratic and very long term. But we need to reignite the financial schemes that make smart forest management possible.
Yeah. There was a question, please.
Yes, it was very close to the previous one, to go a little bit further, not only not living in the country, but what I'm sure is that in Spain, Italy, Greece, Croatia, France, I don't speak about agricultural terrains, I speak about forest. The owners are not known. Not known. Yes, unknown. So it would be interesting to have a study on that, to know what is the percentage of the area with unknown owners. And really, it's a reality. He seems to discover it, but it's a reality. Maybe in Portugal,
Portugal
too.
is huge. You have 1 million, we just made this inventory, you have 1 million registers, and 30% of them, it's unknown. Yeah, 30. And 97% of the land is privately owned, because people left. So, and this is really, is really challenging, because it's a social negative externality to have unmanaged lands posing as a big fire threat. So all the urban society needs to sort out a solution towards that, instead of just buying another airplane, you see?
But if it's unknown, how do you tax then?
You don't tax because the values are so low. Yeah. But no, but it should be the opposite, because it's unmanaged land, the taxes should be higher. It's the wrong economic incentive.
No, I mean, usually if you want to, well, imagine it were managed, then you would tax it.
But if they
But
were,
then you would know whom to tax.
yeah, that is why we are doing the registries now. Okay. But because the land is not profitable, so the taxes are very low. But it should be the opposite. It should not be perverse incentives. It should be
yes,
the positive.
I don't. Well, as a nature conservationist lover, I'm not sure whether I would find it useful to have the highest taxes on land that is used as a, let's say, nature reserve. Then the highest taxes would be on the national parks. I'm not sure whether this is the right option.
I think you're talking about two different things. But I mean, Portugal didn't have a cadastre, and so that's why, I did part of my PhD in Portugal. So, and of course, Tiago knows much more about it. But there's a lot of small landowners in Portugal that live in the city, and then in the rural areas, they still have it's a very small forest plot, and these are unmanaged, and it's forest plantation usually. So this is very different from nature reserves. These are not nature reserves. This is unmanaged forest plantation land, and that goes from parent to child, and so there's a long cultural history to that as well. But yeah, because the owner is not known and because the land is so small, it is not being managed, and that is a fire risk.
Yeah, we have a question there.
Thank you. Lisa Jensen, I'm with the European Parliamentary Research Service. And I just wanted to come back to some of the policy tools that were discussed here. Because I was just reading the Have Your Say, the consultation on an implementing act of the European Commission under the LULUCF regulation for the natural disturbances mechanism, which is basically a mechanism that was put in place with the increased targets of making more carbon removals in European forests, or land use in general, to protect the member states who might experience a natural disaster such as a wildfire, because as you were also pointing out, some of these you cannot stop them. So in the case of member states having made the appropriate efforts to adapt and to limit risks, they could use this natural disaster mechanism to credit the removals that they will be unable to deliver because of the impact that they had. So just to say, there is a consultation on the first steps of the technicalities of how to make this work from 2026 onwards. And of course, I would recommend all of you as scientists to go in and see if it needs any comments. Because I think this is a very important tool to also help the land owners, the forest owners, to collaborate with their member state on how to actually make these preventive actions then. Not only for the technicalities of not having to use this mechanism, but in order to start on the preventive step already, and not just on fighting the fires when they occur. And then also just to point out, because we were talking a little bit about the Common Agricultural Policy, and just last year we saw how a lot of these natural disasters that did happen and that impacted farmers were compensated using cohesion funds. Because the cohesion funds had not been used, and if they had been used to prevent, I'm pretty sure that most farmers would prefer to not have experienced the loss. So to also take this into consideration in the discussions on how to make proactive choices in how you use the financing mechanism. But of course, as Mr. Paulus was also saying, prevention is not as high glory as having stopped a disaster. But I do believe that all the farmers would rather keep their lands and revenues intact than have to compensate a loss, because it will never be one-to-one. So, and just a comment for you, Ms. Paulus. The European Parliamentary Research Service does have a service on European added value, where you can also direct questions in order to have the cost of non-action.
Oh, you want to reply to that?
Yeah.
Okay, and then okay.
I really like your point about farming. So we talk about how fire is changing, and fires are occurring more in places that you don't associate with wildfires. In the very drought summers, we have a lot of fires in cropland, actually, in northern Europe. So in northern France, for instance, Belgium, Netherlands, but also in Germany. And actually, those fires are fire is not bad. But fire in a cropland, in a standing cropland that is intended to create revenue, that is not. my assumption is those are fires that you always want to prevent. And it's so easy to prevent that. And if we just look at our colleagues in the south, I mean, there are countries where on a combine, you're required to have 2 fire extinguishers. And when the air is very dry, so when the relative humidity is very low, they're not allowed to harvest, so they can only do it in the more humid parts of the day. Those are very simple awareness tools that are common in places where there is more a tradition of wildfire risk, and where this education and engagement can really help in preventing fires. And I'm discussing this with colleagues and also with policymakers, and they're saying, oh, farmers are not interested. And my assumption, but who am I as a scientist to say what a farmer needs? I mean, this is where the engagement is needed. But when that engagement takes place, you can indeed look at things. How can you prevent that, and how can you also, in those very summer droughts, keep up the agricultural production?
Thank you. And then 2 short questions first there, and then you please, short ones, please. We are running.
Thanks a lot. Claire Kowalski from DG ECO, so Directorate General for Civil Protection and Humanitarian Aid Operations. It's just a remark, it's not a question. Everybody agree on the importance of prevention. It's clear about what has been said, and especially about we don't have to work in silos. Obviously, it needs to be integrated. 100% agree on this point. But so that's why I think it's quite important when you are presenting conclusions of report. It's just a remark to what has been presented at the beginning. When you are presenting things, we should go from a reactive policy to proactive, to reactive to proactive things. It's not two. You should not oppose things. I think it's a trend that we hear sometimes, and I think it's where the problem. We should not reduce the response and all the things. We should increase prevention, and everybody is agree on this point. But thinking that by reducing and shifting the budget from one side to another side will be the solution, it won't be the solution.
I fully agree, and the working group aligns with that as well. I think that is like I can talk about this more, but I think for our chair, we fully agree. Yes.
Right. Thank you. And there was a question, the last one.
A very short one. I think that in the last maybe 7 to 10 years, in some parts of central Spain and also in central Portugal, many of the policy options that are suggested in the report had been put in practice in some local territories. So my question is, could it be possible to organize a visit to that areas?
Would love to organize, or would love to see if somebody organizes it.
Maybe the 2 of you chat with. Sorry, I forgot your name.
I mean, of course, obviously, what I could try, emphasis is on try, to make this proposal for a delegation of the ENVI committee to go there, but. As I said, it's try. We're the second smallest group in the European Parliament, so I would need some support also from other political groups in order to have a majority, obviously, for that.
Thank you very much for your being here and for your being in the panel. So thank you very much, and then we can sit back, and I will. And I have to say some closing words just to make this evening, close. So I would like to thank Thomas, Orsi, Katalin, and the whole working group for their work for this wildfire report. May I ask working group members to stand up just to show who worked? There are several members of the working group are here. So there were 20 plus more
persons, experts who are not here. So thank you very much for this great work. Great work. And the president of EASAC, Finn van Salos, also extends his sincere thanks, but he cannot be here. Thanks to the colleagues who organized this meeting from the EASAC and also from our local host. Thanks for the audience here and online for being with us. And follow us on social media. You can find on the network, internet where we are. And now I invite you for a coffee and networking, and I close the meeting. Thank you.